There is a particular kind of danger that hides in plain sight. Not the thundering approach of a Titan legion, not the shriek of a Hive fleet blotting out the stars, not the screaming brass horns of a World Eater's war band drunk on blood and fury. No, the most lethal threats in the 41st millennium are the ones that make you feel safe. The ones that let you underestimate them right up until the moment your bones are dust and your regiment is a footnote in a strategium report nobody will ever read. Welcome to the Dark Millennium, where the battlefield is never what it seems, and the armies your commanders dismiss as second tier have a way of rewriting the casualty reports in their favor. If you've ever stood across a table or a shattered rock-crete firebase and thought, "I've got this one handled," then this story is for you. If you crave more tales from the grinding gears of eternal war, hit that subscribe button and join the ranks. The Emperor's light reaches those who answer the call. We begin not with a single battlefield, but with five. 5 conflicts playing out across different star systems, different theaters of war, different commanders making the same fatal mistake. They looked at their enemy and saw weakness. They saw outdated tactics, undergunned forces, armies that veteran officers had long since stopped losing sleep over. They made their plans accordingly. They died accordingly. This is the story of the armies nobody warned you about. The first thing you need to understand about asymmetric warfare in the 41st millennium is that the Departamento Militarum, the vast, a grinding bureaucratic engine that supplies and categorizes the Imperium's military intelligence, is almost always 6 months behind reality. Threat assessments filter through dozens of scribes, dozens of sub-commanders, dozens of Amasec-soaked strategium sessions before they reach the officers who actually need them. By the time a formal threat reclassification reaches the front has already moved, usually backward. This systemic blindness is not a flaw. It is a feature for those clever enough to exploit it. Consider the humble Astra Militarum officer tasked with holding a Manufactorum world on the spinward edge of the Segmentum Obscurus. His briefing tells him the threats are manageable. A scattered war band here, a Xenos raiding force there. Nothing his 3 regiments of Cadian veterans and 2 companies of Hellhound flame tanks cannot handle. He trusts the briefing. Why wouldn't he? It came from the Militarum. It has an official seal. He does not know that seals mean nothing to the things gathering in the dark. The 5 armies we are discussing tonight share a common thread. They have all, at various points in recent campaign history, been classified as secondary threats. Manageable, containable, the kind of enemy you assign to freshly raised regiments as a blooding exercise, the kind of enemy that makes young officers feel confident before their first real engagement. That confidence is the weapon. The Genestealer cults, patient beyond mortal comprehension, have spent generations embedding themselves into the Manufactorum districts of a dozen imperial worlds. See their corrupted bloodlines spreading through worker families across centuries. The Iron Warriors, the siege masters of the Traitor legions, have spent 10,000 years perfecting a method of war that turns every battlefield into a killing ground of their own design before the first shot is fired. The Death Guard, bloated with Nurgle's gifts, have learned that time itself is a weapon, that rot and plague, and the grinding inevitability of entropy will win wars that bolters cannot. And the Orks are always being underestimated, which is remarkable given how many times they have used that underestimation to cave in the skulls of those doing the estimating. Tonight we walk those battlefields. We follow the officers who received the faulty briefings. We watch the moment the scales tip. When the secondary threat becomes the only threat, when the manageable situation becomes the desperate last stand, when the Vox operator's hands shake as he tries to call for reinforcements that are already 3 sectors away. We watch them realize too late what they were actually fighting. Because that is the cruelest gift the Dark Millennium offers. Clarity. Perfect, crystalline, useless clarity that arrives at precisely the moment when there is nothing left to be done with it. The officer staring at the approaching tide finally understands what the Militarum missed. The sergeant in the firebase finally grasps why the enemy let them fortify for 3 days without resistance. The commander in the Chimera finally sees the pattern in what she thought was random insurgent activity. 5 armies, 5 moments of terrible clarity. See 5 battles that the official records will classify as upsets, anomalies, unfortunate encounters with unexpectedly effective opposition. We know better. The underdogs nobody feared are about to remind the galaxy why fear is the only rational response. The first of our 5 stories begins underground. Beneath the Hive city of Warhammer Secundus, 3 kilometers below the smog-choked spires where planetary governor Tessian Vol hosted his weekly tithe reviews, something had been waiting for 63 years. Not a single something, thousands of somethings. Bound by blood and faith and the slow, inexorable pull of a patriarch's will, they moved through maintenance tunnels the Administratum had stopped mapping 4 decades ago. They wore the faces of miners and smelters and waste reclamation workers. They carried their tools to their shifts and ate their rations and filed their labor returns and attended their mandatory worship services at the local shrine to the God Emperor. Though what they whispered under their breath in those shrines had nothing to do with the Emperor's light. This is how the Genestealer cult operates. Now, this is why they are the most dangerous insurgent force in the known galaxy, and why the Militarum's threat assessments consistently, catastrophically undervalue them. The cult on Waaagh Secundus called itself the Brotherhood of the Yielding Stone. It had begun, as all cults begin, with a single infected host. In this case, a deep-core drilling overseer named Havoc Grost, who had cracked open a geological pocket 4 kilometers down and found something waiting inside that pocket, which had been waiting there since long before humans arrived on this world. Grost had not survived the encounter in any meaningful sense. His body continued to function. His eyes continued to see. But the thing behind those eyes was already calculating, already planning, already beginning the slow, patient work of building a congregation. 63 years later, that congregation numbered 47,000 souls across 9 of the Hive city's 16 under-Hive districts. Militant Command Overseer Draina Vecht had been stationed on Waaagh Secundus for 8 months when her Auspex team first picked up the anomalous tunnel readings. She was not an officer who trusted coincidence, a habit she had developed during 12 years of counterinsurgency work across 3 subsectors. She had a lean, methodical intelligence that her subordinates admired and her superiors occasionally found inconvenient. When the Auspex returns came back showing movement patterns that did not match any registered maintenance schedule, she did not file the report and move on. She pulled her most experienced tunnel fighters, veterans of the Morton Underhive campaign, soldiers who knew how to read the dark, and she went down to look herself. What she found was not what she expected. She expected contraband runners, mutant gangs, perhaps a small, chaos-touched prayer circle, the kind that sprang up in Hive underbellies like fungus after rain. What her lumen beams revealed instead was infrastructure. Deliberate, engineered, extensive infrastructure. Tunnels that had been widened and reinforced. Chambers that had been carved out and equipped with supplies. Ammunition, medical equipment, food stocks that would last months, weapons caches that went beyond anything a simple criminal enterprise would need, and carved into every surface, in a script that made her senior sanctioned psyker go pale and reach for his Null Ward medallion, were the 4-armed devotional symbols of the Star Children. Vecht had read the briefings on Genestealer cults. Every officer above the rank of militant overseer received them as part of their mandatory intelligence package. She knew the clinical descriptions. She knew the life cycle, the infection, the hybridization across generations, the slow building of loyal congregations awaiting the signal to rise. She knew it in the way soldiers know about Titan legions, as a theoretical horror, something that happened to other postings, something the briefings mentioned in careful, measured language designed not to cause panic. Standing in that carved-out chamber, her boots on tunnel floor worn smooth by thousands of passing feet, she understood for the first time that the briefings had not been written to inform her. They had been written to contain her fear at a manageable level, and there was nothing manageable about what she was looking at. She keyed her Vox. Actual to command. I need an immediate line to the governor's security staff, and I need every available Arbites unit placed on silent alert. Do not, I repeat, do not broadcast this on any open channel. The Vox crackled. Then it hissed. Then it went silent in the particular way that Vox units go silent when someone with a deeper understanding of your communication infrastructure than you has decided this conversation should not continue. Vecht looked at her tunnel fighters. They looked back at her. In the amber glow of their lumens, she could see the same calculation running behind each pair of eyes. How long had the cult been listening to their Vox traffic? How much of their operational security had already been compromised? Then how many faces in the Underhive that they had walked past, cataloged, dismissed as civilian non-threats were already moving toward predetermined positions? The answer, she already knew, was all of them. The Brotherhood of the Yielding Stone had not been waiting for the Astra Militarum to find them. They had been waiting for the signal from orbit, the approaching tendrils of a Hive fleet still 6 months out, its psychic resonance already stroking the Patriarch's dreams like a lover's hand. The cult's rising was not a reaction to discovery. It was already scheduled. Vecht's team had simply arrived 3 hours before the alarm. Above them, in the Manufactorum districts and the worker hab blocks and the tithe halls and the transit terminals, 47,000 members of the Brotherhood of the Yielding Stone checked their weapons, kissed their families, and began to move. Still with us in the darkness? Hit that like button if this tale is already chilling your soul, and subscribe to witness what comes next when the shadows finally rise. 10,000 years is a long time to perfect anything. The Loyalist Space Marine chapters spend their centuries in honorable crusade, their battle brothers cycling through campaigns, earning glory, writing new pages into their chapter histories with bolter fire and chainsword. It is a noble existence. It produces extraordinary warriors. It does not, however, produce what 10,000 years of singular obsessive focus on a single discipline produces in a traitor legion that has never stopped fighting, never stopped learning, never stopped refining. The Iron Warriors do not seek glory, they seek solutions. On the industrial cemetery world of Karath's Folly, a planet whose very name memorialized a previous commander's catastrophic miscalculation, Imperial Fist's successor, Chapter the Auric Paladins had been tasked with rooting out an Iron Warriors warband that intelligence suggested numbered no more than 200 Chaos Space Marines and perhaps 3 times that in corrupted mortal auxilia. The Auric Paladins deployed 400 Battle Brothers, a full armored company, and 2 Thunderhawk wings. Their chapter master, Idor Vaughn, had prosecuted 11 successful campaigns in the past decade. He was experienced, decorated, and genuinely skilled at the art of war. He had never fought the Iron Warriors on ground of their choosing before. That distinction mattered more than anything else on the briefing slate. That warsmith Haverex Keln had arrived on Karath's Folly 14 months before the Auric Paladins received their deployment orders. 14 months during which his warband had done nothing that Imperial surveillance assets could classify as overtly hostile. They had fortified, yes, but fortification is ambiguous. They had laid void-shielded supply caches throughout the planet's vast network of abandoned Manufactorum districts, but supply caches are not a declaration of war. They had surveyed every approach vector, every choke point, every sight line, every drainage channel and underground conduit, and collapsed transit tunnel on the continent where they had chosen to make their stand. Haverex Keln had turned Karath's Folly into a weapon before the Auric Paladins ever broke atmosphere. This is the Iron Warrior's defining genius. At the thing that 10 millennia of siege warfare has burned into their tactical doctrine at a level that goes beyond training into something approaching instinct. They do not simply defend positions, they architect killing grounds. Every fortification they build is designed not merely to resist assault, but to channel it, to funnel the attacker into pre-registered fire lanes, to create psychological pressure through carefully calculated fields of devastation, to make the very act of advancing feel like a slow drowning in rockcrete and barbed wire and overlapping arcs of traitor bolter fire. The ancient texts of siege warfare call this the preparation of ground. The Iron Warriors call it simply work. Sergeant Praetor Cavan Thresh of the Auric Paladins' 3rd Company was the first battle brother to recognize what they had walked into, which meant he was approximately 12 minutes ahead of Chapter Master Vaughn's formal acknowledgement, and roughly 40 minutes behind when it would have been useful information. Thresh had served 2 campaigns against Iron Warriors detachments in his century of service. Not this warband, not this warsmith, but the same legion, the same doctrine, the same patient malevolence expressed through prefabricated ferrocrete and last-cut firing positions and minefields that didn't announce themselves until the 3rd Squad stepped into them. He knew the signature. He recognized it in the way the first 2 defensive lines had collapsed almost too easily, drawing 3rd Company forward into a district where the buildings on 3 sides had been quietly and invisibly pre-rigged with demolition charges that Haverex Kelm triggered at the precise moment Thresh's Vox crackled with the captain's order to advance. The buildings came down in a specific sequence, not random, not simply destructive. Sequential engineered collapse that created instant rubble walls on 2 approach vectors, while opening a single narrow corridor that led, Thresh understood with cold clarity as he processed the geometry, directly into the prepared kill zone of a Traitor Vindicator battery that had been sitting silent and void-shielded in a Manufactorum Bay for 14 months waiting for exactly this moment. Retrograde! Thresh was already moving, pulling his squad back by sheer force of will and volume. All call signs retrograde. The corridor is a trap. The Vindicators are at bearing 27. The first demolisher cannon shell removed the building Thresh had been standing next to. He was already 3 meters away, ceramite boots churning through debris, dragging a battle brother by the collar of his pauldron. In the Iron Warrior's tactical calculus, a space marine who survives the opening trap but is now separated from his unit, disoriented, reacting rather than acting, is more valuable than a dead space marine. Because a disoriented, reacting space marine makes noise on the Vox, consumes the attention of his officers, pulls reserves toward his position, and generally does the warsmith's organizational disruption work for free. Thresh knew this. He shut down his distress call before it finished transmitting and focused on 3 things: where he was, where his squad was, and then where the next shell was coming from. This was competence in its purest, most desperate form, not the heroic clarity of the charges and the banners, but the grinding, bloody-minded refusal to let the enemy's plan run on rails. Every second Thresh spent thinking instead of reacting was a second the Iron Warrior's timetable slipped. Haverex Kelm, watching from his command bunker through a dozen surveillance servitor feeds, noted the sergeant's behavior with something that might have been professional appreciation. He adjusted his timetable by 4 minutes. It was, he decided, a worthy complication. Patience is not a virtue in the 41st millennium. It is a weapon. Most weapons are loud. They announce themselves with muzzle flash and detonation and the screaming of the dying. They operate on the time scale of seconds and minutes, of fire missions and assault waves, and the brutal arithmetic of bodies traded for ground. Commanders understand these weapons. They train against them. They build their defensive doctrines around the assumption that the enemy wants to win quickly, wants to break through, wants to seize objectives and consolidate and move on to the next engagement. The Death Guard do not want to win quickly. The Death Guard do not want anything quickly. Grandfather Nurgle has blessed his chosen sons with the one gift no imperial stratagem has ever successfully countered: absolute, transcendent, cosmically cheerful indifference to the passage of time. Colonel Commandant Sarah Malt had been holding Fortress Ossivar for 19 days when she first understood this. Not suspected it. Not filed a preliminary assessment suggesting it as a possibility. Understood it in the bone-deep way that experienced officers understand things that the briefings never adequately prepared them for. Standing at her command table at 3 in the morning, watching the latest Auspex returns and feeling something cold settle into her chest that had nothing to do with the fortress's failing heating systems. The Death Guard had not attacked in 19 days. They had arrived, established their cordon, and waited. And in those 19 days, Fortress Ossivar had begun to change. It started with the water. How the fortress drew from 3 deep aquifer taps sunk into the bedrock beneath its foundations, systems that had been functioning without interruption for 200 years of continuous garrison operation. On day 4 of the siege, the water from Tap 2 developed a smell. Nothing dramatic, nothing immediately alarming. A faint organic undertone that the fortress's Mechanicus-trained water servitor flagged as a minor biological contamination, likely soil bacteria disturbed by the Death Guard's initial approach and ground movements. Malt had ordered Tap 2 sealed and switched the garrison to Taps 1 and 3. Standard procedure, textbook response. On day 9, Tap 3 developed the same smell, stronger this time. This is the mechanism by which the Death Guard wage war, the ancient and terrible gift of Nurgle, encoded into their very biology and spread through vectors that conventional military medicine is catastrophically ill-equipped to identify until it is too late. They are walking plague vectors, their bodies hosting ecosystems of engineered contagion so thoroughly intertwined with the Chaos God's will that the diseases they carry do not behave like diseases in any clinical sense. They evolve. They adapt. They find the gaps in filtration systems and the microscopic flaws in sealed environments and the biological vulnerabilities in populations under stress, and they work with the patient, loving thoroughness of a craftsman who has all the time in the universe and genuinely enjoys his work. By day 12, that Malt had lost 40 soldiers to what the Fortress Medici was classifying as acute gastrointestinal failure. By day 15, that number was 230, and 3 of her Medici staff were themselves showing symptoms. By day 19, when she stood at her command table at 3 in the morning, her garrison of 3,000 had been reduced to effective combat strength of approximately 1,800, and the number was declining by roughly 40 soldiers per day. The Death Guard outside the walls had not fired a single shot. Her senior medicae, a sharp-faced woman named Torvin, who had spent 20 years in field hospitals across 4 subsectors and had seen things that gave her the kind of steady, unflinching practicality that passed for optimism in the Astra Militarum. It came to Malt's command center on day 19 with a data slate and an expression that Malt had learned to read as professional honesty overcoming professional reluctance. "The contamination is not natural," Torvin said, setting the data slate on the table with the care of someone placing something they would prefer not to touch. "The pathogen profile is consistent with Vectorium-class plague seeding, Nurglite biological warfare doctrine, pre-heresy origin. It has been engineered to survive in aquifer rock strata at depth and to resist standard Mechanicus purification protocols." She paused. "It was in the water before they arrived, ma'am. They seeded our aquifer system before they established the cordon, before we knew they were coming." Malt looked at the data slate. She looked at the Auspex returns showing the Death Guard cordon, patient and immovable in the gray dawn light, the vast bloated shapes of plague marines standing at their positions with the relaxed posture of soldiers who had nowhere else to be and no particular hurry about any of it. She looked at the casualty projections Torvin had appended to the bottom of the report. At current attrition rates, Fortress Ossivar would fall below minimum defensible garrison strength in 11 days. Without an external relief force, which the nearest available regiment was 22 days away from providing, the mathematics were straightforward. The Death Guard would not need to fire a single shot. They would simply wait until the doors opened from the inside, until the survivors, sick and exhausted and hollowed out by 19 days of slow, invisible defeat, had nothing left to defend with. And then they would walk in with the unhurried generosity of hosts, welcoming guests into a home they had already redecorated to their particular aesthetic. Malt keyed her vox to the garrison-wide channel. Her voice when she spoke was steady in the way that things are steady when everything extraneous has been burned away and only the essential remains. All personnel. This is the Colonel Commandant. Effective immediately, all water consumption will transition to sealed emergency ration packs only. All contaminated systems are to be physically isolated. We are implementing full biological warfare protocols as of this moment. She paused. We have 11 days. We will use every one of them. Ossivar holds. In the gray dawn outside the walls, a plague marine turned to his brother and said nothing. There was nothing to say. 11 days was nothing. 11 days was the blink of a diseased eye. They could wait. The rot spreads and the walls hold, for now. Subscribe to witness the final battles of this dark millennium and comment below. Which of these 5 armies did you never see coming? Nobody respects the Orks. This is, historically speaking, the last mistake a very large number of very intelligent people have ever made. The Imperial tactical assessments of Ork warbands follow a pattern so consistent across 10,000 years of documented engagements that it has become something approaching doctrine by inversion, meaning that the Departamento Militarum has written so many reports concluding that Ork forces represent a manageable, if disruptive, threat, that the conclusion itself has become the assumption, and the assumption has stopped requiring the report. Orks are brutal but disorganized. Orks are aggressive but tactically unsophisticated. Orks possess fearsome close combat capability but lack the strategic depth to sustain prolonged campaigns. Orks are loud and obvious, and their technology is held together with scrap metal and superstition and should not, by any rational assessment of material science, function at all. Every word of this is technically accurate. Every word of this has gotten people killed in numbers that would make a Militarum statistician weep into his ledgers, because the assessments always stop one step short of the conclusion that matters. Yes, Orks are disorganized until they aren't. Yes, their technology shouldn't function. But it does, with a reliability that increases in direct proportion to how many Orks believe it will work, a psychic gestalt effect so deeply woven into the Orkish species that even the most rigorous Mechanicus analysis has never fully quantified it. Yes, they lack strategic depth, until a Waaagh reaches sufficient critical mass, and the war boss leading it turns out to be not merely a larger, louder Ork, but something approaching a genuine military genius, wearing the aesthetics of absolute mayhem. War boss Grakfang Iron Skulls was that kind of war boss. The engagement on Thresh's Landing, a hive world of middling strategic value in the outer reaches of the Ultima Segmentum, had been classified as a containment operation. 2 full regiments of Astra Militarum, a supporting Titan from Legio Destructor, and a company of Ultramarines successors from the Swords of Guilliman chapter had been deployed to suppress what intelligence suggested was a mid-sized Ork warband numbering perhaps 15,000 greenskins, remnants of a larger Waaagh that had been broken 6 months prior in the Vanthos system. Yeah, the intelligence was wrong in the way that intelligence about Orks is always wrong. It had measured the warband at its smallest point, right after the defeat at Vanthos, and had not adequately accounted for the Orkish biological imperative to grow. In 6 months, feeding on the industrial waste and feral livestock of Thresh's Landing's outer continents, the remnant warband had not shrunk. It had bred. It had absorbed scattered groups of feral orcs that had been living in the planet's industrial badlands for decades. It had built. The scrap heaps of 3 abandoned Millennium districts had been consumed and reborn as vehicles that technically should not have moved, but moved anyway, loudly and with great enthusiasm, because 60,000 orcs believed they would. Captain Scion Demetria Waaagh of the Swords of Guilliman had the particular quality of mind that distinguishes exceptional officers from merely competent ones. She updated her assessments in real time rather than defending her prior conclusions. When her Thunderhawk's Auspex returned a heat signature profile on final approach that was inconsistent with 15,000 orcs, but entirely consistent with 60,000, she did not file a query with the Strategium. She immediately voxed the senior Astra Militarum commander, General Prath Ondine, with a single sentence. "General, we have been misled about force strength. I recommend immediate defensive reorientation before we commit to the planned assault corridor." Ondine, to his credit, listened. He had the regiment's pivot within 40 minutes. The pulling back from the assault corridor and establishing a layered defensive line anchored on the Hive city's outer walls. It was fast work, professionally executed, and it saved approximately 40% of his force from being caught completely out of position when Grakfang Ironskulls launched his Waaagh 3 hours later. Because that was the thing about Grakfang that the intelligence had also failed to capture. He was not merely big and loud and covered in iron skull trophies bolted directly through his own green hide. He was cunning in the specific, devastating way that certain orcs develop cunning, not the subtle, layered cunning of an Eldar autarch or the cold mathematical cunning of a Chaos warsmith, but the cunning of a creature that has survived 10,000 individual combats by learning, however unconsciously, to read the battlefield the way other beings read text. To feel the weight of ground and momentum and morale the way a musician feels rhythm. He had watched the Imperials pivot. He had seen the defensive reorientation and processed it with the part of his brain that handled tactical problems, which was considerably larger and more sophisticated than any Imperial xenobiologist had formally documented. And he had smiled. A terrible expression involving approximately 400 individual teeth, and changed his plan. The assault that hit Ondine's line did not come from the expected direction. It came from 3 directions simultaneously, with the largest element, 20,000 screaming orcs in a tide of scrap metal vehicles and biological mass that shook the ground like an earthquake with opinions, and hitting the junction between the 2 Imperial regiments where the defensive coordination was thinnest. It hit with the force of a battering ram the size of a continent and the enthusiasm of a species that had been waiting 6 months for exactly this moment. Vaagh's Swords of Guilliman company hit the junction from the Imperial side at a dead sprint, bolters firing, filling the gap with ceramite and controlled violence. She ran the defense of that junction for 6 hours, holding ground that should have collapsed in 20 minutes through a combination of tactical instinct, absolute refusal to yield, and the specific rage that Space Marines develop when they are being pushed backward. The Titan fired into the orc mass until its plasma reactor ran hot enough that the Princeps pulled it back from the line to prevent catastrophic overheat. The Astra Militarum regiments bled and held and bled again, and Grakfang Ironskulls drove his personal battle wagon through a building that was technically on the wrong side of the junction line, stood up in the wreckage with a claw the size of a sentinel walker, and a grin that contained multitudes, and roared something in Orc that needed no translation. He was having the time of his life. 5 armies, 5 battlefields. 5 moments when the calculus of war shifted in ways that the briefings never predicted and the assessments never captured. Militant Overseer Vecht fought the rising of the Brotherhood of the Yielding Stone through 48 hours of Underhive warfare, losing 2/3 of her tunnel fighters before external forces could respond. The cult was broken, but not destroyed. In the Munitorum's records, Vorakan Secundus is classified as a successful containment. 3 star systems away, a new patriarch dreams. Sergeant Thresh pulled 11 battle brothers out of Haverex Keln's killing ground. The Auric Paladins lost 63 of their 400. Before the engagement ended in a withdrawal, the official records call a strategic redeployment. The Iron Warriors are still on Karath's Folly. They have had 4 more months to work. Colonel Commandant Malt held Fortress Ossivar for 11 days on sealed rations and sheer will. The relief force arrived on day 21. What walked out of those gates when the doors finally opened was a garrison that had survived, which is not the same thing as a garrison that was whole. Captain Sion Vala held the junction at Thresh's Landing until Grakfang Ironskulls denied the decisive breakthrough he needed before nightfall, pulled his forces back to regroup. It was not a victory, it was a postponement. 60,000 orcs do not leave, they accumulate. The lesson of these 5 armies is not tactical. It is not a matter of updated threat assessments or improved Militarum filing protocols or better intelligence networks. The lesson is older and simpler and more brutal than any of that. In the 41st millennium, the most dangerous enemy is the one you stop being afraid of. The Emperor protects. More stories await.
you.